everyone, and welcome to day 2 of this seminar with our International Scientific Advisory Board. Here we have Marjolin Hasnot and we have Peter Osterver and Sue Halliday. And there's some new persons today that weren't here yesterday. They are people from our external board and some other people, also researchers, Liselott from Karolinska Institutet. Basically, I'll soon hand over to Johanna Ståhl, our moderator for today. But I will just say a few things. So today is going to be filmed, and the purpose for that in the morning is to be able to also share your feedback and these discussions with persons from our external board that weren't able to be here today. So that will only be for internal use. We will not put that on any website or so. But in the afternoon, where we'll get to hear lectures from our guests, this will actually be used publicly. And all of you have responded that you're okay with being in the film in case you ask questions or so. But if you have changed your mind, please talk to me or to Marta during the break. So that's basically it. And some information about the filming also, that there are now microphones in the ceiling, and so if, for instance, you in the corner there just talk very between you two, it will actually be caught by the microphone. So just keep that in mind today. So I'll hand over to Johanna Ståhl.
Yes.
Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, and I don't need that. Good morning, and I hope you had a nice evening. I left a little bit early, so I don't know how long you stayed. Yeah, today will be a very interesting day. For those of you that haven't met me, my name is Johanna Ståhl, and my organization that I come from, Camino, is a partner organization to the Mistra project. But what I do is that I'm a journalist, or I'm editor-in-chief for the magazine Camino, but also I do a lot of lectures, and I write books and different things that has to do with writing and sustainable lifestyle. So that's basically me. And today, as I said, will be a very interesting day. We will start in the morning by listening to feedback from our 3 experts here on yesterday's research presentations, but also on the program overall. So we have quite a long time for this in the morning, so I hope there will be discussions, and don't be afraid to talk. And in the afternoon, after lunch, we will listen to your presentations about your research and finish up with panel discussions. So if you gather questions about their research, write it down, and we can lift it on the panel discussion at the end. So I welcome the 3 of you up here, Sue Halliday, Peter Osterver, and Marjolin Hasnot, to sit here so we can all see clearly. And you have 2 mics. You have this one and the other one. I'll leave the floor to you. Yeah.
Well, thanks for inviting us for the yeah, for giving feedback. And I think if I speak for us all, we really enjoyed yesterday, and that was a very interesting presentation, and also the open discussion about the work. Um, well, so we tried to summarize our feedback, and just made a list of bullet points that we would like to discuss. We didn't really rehearse how to present it, but well, let's do this together. Um, and I think we wanted to start with yeah, with a very notion about the work packages that we really liked, with having the different yeah, the cross um, the cases on the food and the furniture and the vacation, and then having both the private, public, and policy sector, but also we very much liked that work package 6 is there to integrate all the results, and we think that is really important. The only worry that we have about that is that it seems to be only at the end, and I think that's also what we discussed yesterday a bit, is that it might be good to have some of the integration or a framework already at front, so that it's easier to synthesize all the results at the end. And I think that's one of our recommendations, to yeah, to start with that earlier.
Yes, I mean we see and admire, you know, as we have all along, the breadth of this project, and the different things that you're looking at, and we all recognise what a huge issue it is to think about going niche to mainstream, and to think about taking something as broad as sustainable consumption, and then to take large areas like vacationing and furnishing and food. So that each of those areas is very large. Food in particular, of course, is particularly complex. So I think there was an emphasis on food yesterday, and I think that is because it is the more complex area for practices. And talking together as a group, it's also a very, it's a largely sort of routine and extremely frequent set of practices compared to us going on holiday, and of course compared to furnishing homes. Um, but as we talked yesterday, and discussed this whole issue of time, the time it's taking for the program to be researched, and the impact of research on the participants, and potentially the impact of news about the climate, of news about technology innovations, etc., over the period of the research, we were really trying to sort of capture that essence of incorporating time into this project, not just saying, well, it's taking a few years, we have to do this, then we have to do that, we have to do something else, it all takes time. And so we saw Work Package 6 as potentially a vehicle for you to overtly, explicitly include time into your work, and that's why we're sort of suggesting that after this, you might think about how you can really start Work Package 6 now, talk amongst yourselves and do some integration now, and as we talked a little bit yesterday, think about how you can integrate stakeholders, vision holders, and actually have the findings so far impact on them, change them potentially, record those changes, and have that as part of the whole project.
Yes, well, I fully agree. I just want to add that I mean the team is very large, so there are many people involved, and our justification for suggesting that work packet 6 could be starting earlier would also be a little bit more to streamline the different people involved in the program. In the sense that if you do not do it on time, the risk is that the different work packages fulfill their own assignments in their own way. Then in the end, work package 6 has to make sense of everything. These are the results of the different work packages. And if you start earlier, then you can have more feedback into maybe changes or questions that could be taken up by different researchers in the different work packages. So that's facilitating the conclusion in work package 6, but also harmonizing the work of the different other people involved. That was, I'm not sure, do you want to discuss things, our comments now one by one, or do you want us to present everything and then open up the discussion?
You can decide what you think is the best. Otherwise, you can just take work pack by work pack if you don't have a plan.
No, we didn't really work per work package. So the schedule was that we should do 1 to 4 before the break and then 5 to 6 afterwards. But we didn't stick to our assignment.
No, you don't have to
We
do
were
that.
stubborn.
You can do it the way you want.
So we thought we identified a number of different issues which we considered important.
But maybe you can then take a few points and then respond with it, right? Yeah.
Yes, I mean, so not only is this a large project on a quite an unwieldy topic, sustainable consumption, across 3 very different areas, but of course you're bringing very different expertises to this project, which is great and necessary and important for having useful outcomes. But we also noticed through the day what always happens when you get academics from slightly different disciplines. You either start using the same words and they have a different meaning, or you're using different words and they have the same meaning. And so we really felt that perhaps, I mean, you might feel differently, but perhaps one of the real benefits of having us turn up is not so much us, but you being together and talking together and hearing one another. And so we feel that you might now usefully develop a glossary amongst yourselves of how you're using these words and how you're going to be using them in your ongoing research and then in the ongoing presentations and dissemination of your work. And we thought that would really help, because one of the reasons why these topics are hard to grasp is that people talk across each other. And it's such an important topic. I mean, I think we're all completely convinced of the usefulness of this project. We want it to be as easy to communicate without this complexity to get, so that at an early stage, and preferably sort of reasonably soon, you usefully use time together to develop a shared vocabulary.
No, I think we should maybe add
the next one. Yeah, the next one. You can now follow it. Yeah, that's bullet number 3. A key element, of course, of the discussion is sustainability, and because that's in the title of the program, and it's all around in all the different activities. So we've been talking quite a long time about how to deal with that, because you did not define sustainability, but still there is an attention, particularly in work package, to measure the impact. So then you somehow have to define sustainability, or at least get an idea of sustainability, which may be larger than what you determined to measure. I mean, you can have a broader definition of sustainability and then consciously decide to say, okay, we can and we want only to measure these things. But there has to be more transparency in that process, in our view. Um, um, yeah, maybe leave the taxonomy for later, I guess. So if you are have a definition of, or at least a broad definition of sustainability and clear on what you want to measure, then different work packages know where to refer to and position them against that broader definition and against those issues that I mentioned that are being measured. I think that's it's a more specific term from the glossary that really deserves attention, particularly because you want to score different niches in terms of sustainability. Even if you have a bottom-up process, there has to be some sort of assessment of the performance.
Yeah, maybe to add to that is that we thought if you have this broad definition, you can also look at maybe different dimensions of sustainability, and then different parts of the project could address these different dimensions. Then it's not that strict if that's the reason why you didn't have that, but at least then you know what you are talking about. And I think there are examples I know from, for example, from what security, they have these different dimensions, and they with different studies they measure the different dimensions. It can also be grouped later, so you have one idea, and that can also help to um, yeah, to describe if from niche to mainstream if it has succeeded, or with maybe which parts of sustainability are reached or are mainstreamed.
So we're not asking for a reductionist definition that you spend a long time arguing about. We're saying all the richness we want to capture. So it's some sort of multi-dimensional model, and not all of you is looking at all of it, but so that you can always be slotting your research somewhere onto this definition, this broad, rich definition of sustainability. Because what we found, if we can go to our third slide perhaps, Caroline. So we together, when we looked at this slide again talking last night, and it was emphasised I think through the day that work package 1 was feed into work package 2, which would then inform the next 3 sets of case studies. It's not clear quite what those sustainable consumption practices are, and then we've got these analyses of effects, and all of a sudden really we've got environment, public health and economy, which really haven't featured as far as we can see too much in work package 1 in defining sustainable consumption practices. And so we thought if you continued without some sort of shared and agreed but rich model, you'd be open to critique again. On 1 minute you're talking about this, then you're talking about that, then you're talking about something else, and that would be unhelpful. So we did just spend some time sort of really reflecting on this slide and feeling that at the moment the connections aren't really there, and that's where we're hoping that you'd be able to make connections now at this relatively early stage, so that you could acknowledge that for measuring we're only looking at water and land use or emissions or something, but that's not exactly what you're looking at in some of the case studies, and nor is it necessarily part of all the visions that were held by the 4 parties that you asked for to develop their own vision. We also wanted to link it to the sustainable practices taxonomy, but I don't know if someone else.
Later on.
Okay.
Maybe we should announce it. I mean, I could start, and then maybe.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that's from my perspective, I think that's valuable. All of your comments so far. In terms of this suggestion of developing a glossary, that's really something we could do, as you suggest, maybe for the program. I mean, it's one thing if you're developing a glossary for whatever world, then it becomes so much more complicated. But yeah, working definition for us, I think that's an idea for some of our key concepts. And in terms of, if you go to that slide where we have the work package, yeah. And I mean, when we started in work package 2, we had, as you notice, a rather broad outlook also to capture things that weren't necessarily thought of as sustainable consumption with discussion in different groups and so on. And when we gathered examples, we had a set of dimensions in our questionnaire in terms of, okay, so what does this practice entail? Where it entails less environmental impact, empowering the local community, better conditions for the producers. There was a set of different dimensions that was, in a sense, also hinting towards that sustainable consumption could be not only about reducing CO2. But how do we work with that further on? I think that's a key question, and I think it's really good what you say in terms of not to be reductionist, because sometimes we can become very reductionist because that's where we have the tools and the assessments, and I think that's something we have been discussing a bit also, the linkages between work package 1 and 2, that the tools, often CO2 or greenhouse gases, water, land use, to some extent public health, but measuring empowerment or food security, increase social cohesion. How do we deal with that? And it's more, but somehow we cannot just throw it out. Maybe that is something that's coming back in case studies, for instance.
Yes.
Paper on repair and sufficiency, for instance. There are elements of empowerment there. But somehow get more structure here. Yeah. So that was just some reflections. I don't know if people from work package 2 would to comment or, and maybe some terms of work package 6.
Yeah, so I mean, I recognize we've had similar discussions before also, and I totally agree that this is not these three dimensions that is not covering sort of sustainability. I think I said so in the presentation yesterday as well. Then I think we might need to consider first of all how we sort of package the whole thing in what we will write as a synthesis report. And define, as some of you said, that what a broad definition of sustainability, and then describe what we analyze and what we do not analyze, and what do we bring in knowledge from previous research, because we will eventually always have to choose between some themes to actually do our own research on, so that we map out what are sort of the contributions from the analysis in work package 2, but we could at the same time take a broader approach when we sort of support the other parts of the project and also engage the other work packages in that. So I think it's so that we provide a product that sort of is clear and transparent regarding what's included, what other sort of maybe qualitative inputs could be provided and sort of sent on to the other work packages and so on. So I think it's also about framing that in this synthesis report that we plan.
Yes, I think it's about the time. Starting work package 6 now, I think is a good idea. And then I'm I'm still not sure how to incorporate it with the. But we'll have to discuss this more. We will have like a joint 2-day workshop in August in which we will have time to go deeper into these issues that you brought up. I think we have to spend some time on that to see how work package 6 can become like a process, almost like a process leader of everything else then, I guess. And I was thinking that yesterday when we talked a bit about gaming and the serious gaming, that one way could be to start developing a format for that, and then all other work packages would have to like fill in, like scorecard specific formulas, so that in work package 6 we will have a specific type of data that we can work with, having gaming with politicians, for example, and stakeholders. So maybe to start develop that and game now would be a way to start that. Maybe, I'm not sure. But I have to think, ask you what you think.
It's exactly one of the ideas that we had in our last slide.
Very good. That's okay. And then I had another question about more to you, that we were a lot of competencies and a lot of resources, but I was thinking if you had, when you talked, if you had identified any competencies that we are missing or dimensions that we are not exploring that we should add. So also a question to you.
Yeah, well, a good question which we haven't thought about. So the answer is as a group we have no responses immediate to your question. I'm quickly thinking about it, and while discussing it yesterday, it was not an obvious thing that was missing in my view. You can always think about more specialized knowledge. I don't know, like in the case of food nutritionists, to know what the unexpected or indirect effects are of focusing more on sustainability and production. But and that could be the same for other fields. But I'm not sure whether that's necessary. I mean, as a general, you may have an incidental expert to look at your findings, but not the systematic inclusion. Because it would also complicate even more the communication that is already difficult. So that's why I'm hesitating to suggest you should add these kind of specialists to that, because, well, because of that. Yeah. Whether you
I mean, it probably all seems a long time ago now, but when you were first thinking of this project and imagining what it could be and imagining who you might be working with, it was probably a process of adding. And then you get the fantastic result, you're successful, so you start thinking, oh, we've got to do this now, and you sort of have a timeline and you start working away on your areas according to the prescribed dating, timing of it. But actually, as we talked together, we felt that there was a need for, I mean, you can't say everything about sustainable consumption. It's too large. So, but we would really love you to have, outcomes at the end that make a difference, that make changes. I mean, I think this whole project isn't about having a look at sustainable consumption. It's about movement. It's about development. It's about going from niche to mainstream. It's about enabling it to be changed. So actually, the challenge now is, I think, not so much to add, which you could obviously keep on doing for quite a long time in one sense, but then you would not be getting back to having one project that's making sense, that you can talk about and that you can communicate, and from which you can develop some tools for assisting and enabling change. I think that's really the point. So I think you've already gone through a process of addition, and really now the challenge, quite a large group different kinds of expertises, you're from different places, you're under different kinds of time pressure yourselves. That's fantastic that you've got a 2-day workshop organised for August. Now I think is the time for drawing in and shared understanding, shared vocabulary, shared model. And then you can say we're just contributing to this bit of the model and that bit of the model. Rather as everyone went through the day yesterday, you had that work package 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and each of you sort of highlighted the bit that you were talking about and the bit that you fed into. So we just have this sort of multidimensional model so that when each of you speaks, one bit gets lit up or 3 bits get lit up or the whole thing gets lit up. And then that enables you to communicate. And then, as Peter said, later on, other people say, well, you really should have had a such and such a person. Well, fair enough. You either get an expert critique or you develop a new project where you say, we'll take all the findings and we'll add in these 6 areas that we didn't know we needed at the beginning of the last project.
Yeah, maybe to add to that, I think that's also the value of this project is that you compare the different fields and that you draw lessons from that. What if we want to have sustainable consumption on the food, the furniture, and the vacation? What kind of characteristics of key lessons can we draw from that? And that's how can we apply that to other fields? And I think that's also the value of this project, bringing these different things together, but then have these more generic lessons on this sustainable consumption for that. And I think that's maybe also our fourth bullet, where we say, yeah, so a part of, well, it seemed yesterday that a lot of the approach was quite descriptive, while we also think there's this value of this project by comparing and drawing these generic lessons from all, yeah, so more, yeah, cross comparison within the project. And we think that could also provide very valuable high impact papers instead of these separate cases that are very descriptive. I think the high impact can come from these comparisons.
Yeah, we in general we found that there were quite a lot of publications, reports and articles expected. I didn't check the initial proposal, but we're wondering whether that was feasible in practical terms to make all these papers. But if they are mainly descriptive, you have a difficulty in getting them published. So we were thinking that it is more effective and also more interesting in terms of the findings to make more analytical and therefore comparative papers, particularly between the 3 different kind of practices that you're interested in. Then they have different characteristics, particularly the daily routines, annual and multi-annual routines. So there's a lot of interesting lessons to be drawn from that. And so instead of focusing on descriptive per practice, there will be a higher level publication comparing the different ones and more analytical in terms of papers.
Not sure. And yeah, that's part of the problem with the structure then, I guess, that you have separated. Well, in work packages 3, 4, and 5, they will be dealing with both food, furnishing, and education. So should it be possible to do that? Also, in work packages 5 and 6, when we but then the idea was to go back to discussing food and then all kinds of changes for actors, board sections. Maybe we should do that. We should discuss outside of these different practices. I mean, maybe we should compare them.
Yeah, I think we see, really found that the fact that you have different practices, but also different kinds of practices, different categories of practices together in this project is is particularly an added value. So if you keep them separate, then you cannot profit from the fact that you have them all three. So, and particularly work packets 3, 4, and 5, they cover each of them all three practices, but from a different angle. So there, obviously, comparison would be something that needs to be done. But actually, I wasn't aware that work package 6 would only look at food. I thought that it would also cover all three kinds of practices.
Yeah, it would look at all different kinds of practices, but the idea was then to look, draw lessons from work packets 3, 4, and 5, and then look at only food and only vacationing and only furnishing, like separately, and then because then we would bring the 3 work packages together, 3, 4, 5 for each sector again. So that was the idea. Maybe we can rethink that.
I think one of the advantages of starting work package 6 earlier is that you can start thinking about these things in practice. It's one thing to imagine, and it's a perfectly good way of imagining it, and it might be the right way to do it. But we also felt that if you're not careful with work package 6, you'll be kind of exhausted and the time will be running out, and it'll really be an absolutely horrendous thing to suddenly integrate this thing where people have gone off in slightly different directions using slightly different words, and now time's running out, and so we were trying to sort of take your really good idea, which we picked up, you learned from a previous project was needed, this integration, and so as you pointed out, so we really saw it as a process to help you throughout the project. And so I think in a way it stops you having to predict at the moment quite what you're going to do at the end.
I think what you said before, like having the 3, 4, and 5 and compare that for one policy field, I think is also interesting, because then you have the different actors that are involved in only on food. So I think, having this comparison and integrating these results is interesting also, but then also the different sectors. I think that. So both are, I think, valuable, especially also because these different actors can influence each other and also influence each other, and also whether it's possible to go from niche to mainstream. You probably need all these actors. So that's why it's needed to integrate that. I guess in addition to what you say about process from work package 6, and that's also when we go to the 5th bullet, is that we see, partly maybe work package 6, but maybe also work package 2 can provide more theories or conceptual framework that can guide the project and can make sure that everyone is providing some similar types of results that you can then use to integrate in work package 6. So in addition to the glossary, but also have this conceptual framework. I'm not sure if it's only work package 6, but at least it needs to be somewhere in the whole project so that you can integrate the results and work on something together. And then maybe fill parts of this conceptual framework in different work packages. And we also felt it's probably in there. So we did see that, but it was not made explicit. That's more or less what we thought. And then that's why we said, well, there's a need for theories on, and then we have 3 parts of for which we think there are theories needed. Not that they are not there in the project, but they are there. But yeah, there were bits and pieces, and it was not decided on what to choose actually. So, and bits and pieces in different projects, and then again, it will be difficult to integrate the lessons from all these different parts. maybe we can go through them. Maybe you can do the taxonomy.
Let's go to taxonomy. So, again, if we go to the slide where they've got so we didn't notice when you were presenting this, so it was very compelling presentation, obviously. But I'm looking at it again, unless we've missed it, we couldn't really see vacationing. Yes, of course.
Actually, I mean, we made this with vacationing, but then when I was doing the PowerPoint, it was too much information, so I so it's actually in there.
We missed it.
Yeah. No, actually, we've been. There are examples. Actually, we thought a lot about finding a taxonomy that works for all of these sectors, which isn't that easy because it's kind of different. I mean, often the vacationing practices are more related to services than actual products, and in terms of food, they're in a sense disappear after you've consumed them. So there are slightly different types of entities we're talking about here. But having done different variants here, this works for vacationing as well. So, yeah.
I mean, it's a slightly separate thought, but it's been kind of whirring around in my mind a bit all day yesterday and today, because services is my area of knowledge. And I've been hearing quite a lot of sort of product and production focused stuff. In terms of, downshifting, consuming less and sufficiency, a lot of the direction that you're taking things is from having a product into turning it into a service. I buy a house or I rent accommodation, I buy furniture or I rent it for a while. And the sharing economy and collaborative economy is all around really turning goods into services. So actually there's quite a, that almost throwaway comment, we found it hard to fit it in because it was a service, is a pointer to something really useful that can come out of this whole project. Because you are dealing with goods and services, because a lot of the mechanisms for sustainability are turning goods into services, then you should be able to come up with both tools and some theory to help that. So I wouldn't shy away from the difficulty. Again, in this taxonomy and in spotting that you didn't have vacationing in there, we wouldn't want it to end up that you've got 56 different sustainable consumption practices, because I think that's too complicated. But nor were we wanting, again, to sort of reduce it and make sure that you forced vacationing into these 8 areas. It may be that there's 9 areas, 10 areas, 11 areas. But we felt that, so that was one point, and you've answered it in the sense of, course you didn't miss it, but you just dropped it out for various reasons. So having got this taxonomy, it didn't seem to us that it was then used too much. And so what we're thinking is that this taxonomy can be with the 8 areas, maybe a couple more, once you've added vacationing in the examples. That these would be the beginnings of your multidimensional model of sustainable consumption. That the model is a series of practices for you. And then obviously below each of the grey, green and pink areas you've got the examples, and you'd have some more examples, but to try and imagine and conceive of, conceptualize and think about sustainable practices in terms of this taxonomy. We thought it was probably quite important for you.
Yeah, maybe to add to that, I think you really did a great analysis with all these, I think 700 studies, and you had this nice circles where you draw lessons from all these practices. And if you build upon this taxonomy and then maybe also these different visions and these different practices, then that could be a very great paper where you draw a lesson from all these 700 studies. That's an enormous amount of work, and this could be one of potentially high impact paper. Like, what is sustainable consumption? Well, we did 700. Analyzed 700 studies, and these are the visions and the practices that we saw in this. And based on that, we built this taxonomy of consumption practices, and we build it also on this taxonomies of Tucker and whatever. But at least this is also your own analysis, and this could be a very great paper. So I think you can be more proud about what you did there.
I just wanted to follow up, if I understand both the discussion from part of the discussion from yesterday and now correctly, you're arguing for a more all-encompassing approach that tries to generate findings that are true across the three consumption areas. Correct me if I'm wrong. Or rather also to do that.
Maybe a slightly differently formulated, we suggest you try to draw lessons from comparing the different kinds of practices. So not generalizing, but learning by comparing.
Right. And on that note, in terms of how to approach that, because there are obviously challenges to that in, we briefly talked about that yesterday, the fact that furnishing, vacationing, and food are rather distinct areas of consumption in the characteristics, in their characteristics, and you could argue that they are quite separate. They do not easily fall under the same type of consumption, and therefore, I feel that to some degree it feels a little safer to approach them first, each separately, and then as a follow-up step, if possible, to attempt comparisons and to draw more general lessons. I got the impression yesterday and also today that you think that might be a little too late, or that might be a little too conservative and careful in how to approach this.
Well, I think our fear is that you get too descriptive if you do that. So then, when you compare them in the end, you have problems in comparing them. So you could only. In my view, either you have a very clear conceptual framework that you then use for analyzing the different kinds of practices. So then you can do that individually and then draw generalizable lessons from those, or you try to combine the analysis at the same time to draw lessons through the comparison between the different practices, and you combine. I would say sort of a grounded theory approach, that you have some key dimensions, key elements, such as from the taxonomy, or that you then use and generate lessons through the study and the comparative approach. Because if you study them separately, then the question is, where are you going to look for? What is your point of attention? There are so many things that you can look at. So if you do not have a very clear framework, then you get information, you get data, but whether or not that will in the end lead you to any kind of analytical point of view, I'm not sure about. I guess that's unlikely.
I guess really what we're saying is that we don't really see data collection and data analysis as two completely separate tasks. That you see what, in some extent, you see what you're looking for. You can't see everything ever. So you are paying attention to something. Without any guidance at all, you might just be paying attention to the driving point that your interviewee wants you to hear. So there's many things that you might be paying attention to. And although we've described, because that's how we've heard it yesterday, your work as largely descriptive and perhaps too descriptive for really good papers, this taxonomy has already got quite conceptual areas in it. So all this work has been done, and you've got these 8 conceptual areas. Oh, I haven't got the right slide, I'm sorry. Yeah, so that in the grey, the green and the pink there, you've got 8 conceptual areas. So I think we're suggesting that there may be a few more once we have vacationing in there, that may be more relevant if you're then going to be doing case studies on services. But to be looking at and doing the work with these analytical concepts in mind, but not dictating. So we're not suggesting one conceptual framework, but you have them in mind. And then as you maybe collect data and work out these analytical concepts don't all work, you need something else, then you feed that back into the project as a whole and say, actually, there's something else emerging here. So that you don't have everything in a linear time fashion. And I think there is a sort of almost a philosophical thing here that we perhaps don't even believe that you can collect data, analyze the data, and then produce your results. I think it's a much more processual, iterative process.
Just a comment on, I think that's valuable what you're saying here, that we can make perhaps more use of this taxonomy, not only as one paper. I mean, the plan is to make a paper this year on this, but it could be something we could use more in the project. And somehow reflect on, do we capture these different phases or dimensions of sustainable consumption in our analysis and in our whatever recommendations or whatever we come up with, or possibly throughout the project also see, are there other, or do we need to adapt or change things here? Because there is some element here in this taxonomy, a bit like going from more eco-efficiency towards more circular economy use, sharing economy, towards more changing the system in a sense. So we don't just end up with similar case studies or examples. They're all about sharing, renting, for instance, or they're all about buying a better product. So I think that was it was valuable to think about. I think we saw it as work in Pact 1, and then here you go, and then move on with other stuff. But that's true.
I think so. That's one part of the theories that we think that can support the project. And the other one is more like, if the project is about how can we go from niche to mainstream, we also need to, again, have a framework or an idea on what do we need to know to analyze how we go from niche to mainstream. So and Peter has some ideas about that.
Okay, yeah. Basically, you the title is From Niche to Mainstream, so mainstreaming is a key issue. And we heard yesterday several references to some conceptual frameworks, but it was not made explicit. And we think you should be more explicit on how you think about mainstreaming, because in the end that's what it's all about. So you need to have some more theoretical concepts, conceptual tools that allow you to discuss the process of mainstreaming. And this is an old one. It's by Rogers, 1962, The Diffusion of Innovations, and that's the traditional view of innovations that start with just a few people picking up the initiative diffusion. And then after you have a large group of opinion leaders or local leaders or influencers, as they nowadays are called, then you move up to the what's called the tipping point. Uh, then it really takes off, and then you become occupying a larger share of the field. So that's a very conventional way of thinking about mainstreaming. And so you look at the niches, like we also partly discussed yesterday. Look at the niches. Where are the good things, the difficult things in the niches? You try to improve the niches and see how you can bring in local leaders or examples. We talked about champions. These kind of tools are part of this framing of mainstreaming. Okay, and this is one, and there's another one, which of course was also referred to by several of you. This is the multi-level perspective. I'm not sure whether that's familiar to you. I guess for many of you this is familiar. So you can basically see the same kind of process starting at the niche level at the bottom left, and then an arrow moving up to the middle, because there the key argument is that how things are going, so how practices are organized, how many dimensions of many fields of social life are organized, has a particular structure, what they call a social technical regime, a dominant way of doing, dominant way of producing and consuming food or energy, whatever. That dominant regime is hanging together of a number of dimensions: technology, policy, science, culture, markets, industry, and these are dynamically hanging together. So that means it's not changing. It's not stable, fixed. It may change, it may adapt, but it basically continuing the same way of doing without radical change. And talking about the kind of niches that you are interested in, talking about more radical change. So that the argument here is that requires a change of the regime, an opening up of the regime. And that opening up of the regime can be through pressure from very successful, promising niches, but it can also through influence, external influences, what is called here the social technical landscape. Oh, well, yeah. So you see, the social technical landscape may put pressure on the regime. For instance, climate change is it seems as a very clear external influence putting pressure on energy system, mobility systems, etc. So that the argument is then the social technical regime may open up and then allow for innovative niches to become a new regime or included in a new regime. So then become the dominant way of doing. If you take this perspective, it means that you have to analyze not just the niches. It's important to analyze the niches, but you also have to analyze the dominant regime to see how you can make a niche, an innovation, mainstream. It not just depends on the quality of the niche; it also depends on the regime, how open a certain regime is for change, how that regime is hanging together in these different dimensions, and what pressure from the wider social technical landscape is on that. So that would be a different way of analyzing mainstreaming. So this is Frank Geels and others who published a lot on this. The third one I want to refer to is from a colleague at Wageningen, and he looked at innovations in agriculture. He is interested in the process of scaling. So basically, also from niche to a wider scale, to larger scale. And the key point here is that he also links it, by the way, to this multi-level framing, but he insists on the fact that it's an integrative and iterative process, moving from one innovation to mainstreaming, or what is called scaling here. From innovation to scaling is not a one I got a straight line or one arrow, but it's a process to find out of that innovation what works, what fits into wider practices, find out what is responsible way of doing that, and then making it at a larger scale. And that may be a process that is going on for several times. So then it's a more processual approach, an iterative approach to upscaling than the simple line of Rogers, or also the simple, let's say, the one-directional line that the multi-level perspective is suggesting. Why are we presenting this? Basically because you are implicitly talking about mainstreaming and using different framings, I guess, and it's important to be more explicit on the process, on how you look at it. That's the main argument, and no, no particular argument to say you should use this or that one, but it's the challenge to you to be explicit on the process of mainstream.
Yeah. I think we'll comment on that at the end, I think. But yeah, thanks for that. Or anybody else wants to comment on it?
Or do you have other framings of mainstreaming in the back of your mind? Maybe that would also be interesting.
Just a quick question. You presented three options. Do you have a preference? Which of the three did the three of you agree on one of those that you thought was better than the others?
We didn't vote, so I don't know. Well, I must say I like this one, and it's more elaborate, developed in combination with the multi-level. So that makes it an interesting, although also problematic, because it gets much more complicated than the simple line of Rogers. But this allows for a more practice-based approach to mainstreaming, rather than the simple niche idea of upscaling.
Can I just ask, I mean, now this is in agriculture innovation, so it's not the everyday consumer perhaps, but where does the perception or whatever, the value of the consumer come in? Is that in what works or what fits?
Find out what is responsible. So there's the responsibility, so that's the sustainability dimensions are there. And what fits into everyday life practices of consumers.
Okay, so that's the demand.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is we really need this. I just wonder more concretely and micro level. In several papers, we work on barriers and drivers to change. And I think all of us, or most of us, are interested in what barriers are there from conventional society or mass consumer society. For instance, if I want to scale down and have less furniture or use old furniture, I'm afraid that my kids will be bullied at school, that we're a weird family and so on. That's very daily life, but would that be part of the regime? So I mean those little things, as well as taxes and infrastructure and the heavy stuff. Yeah, it's or all those parts of the regime that you want us to dive into and see how can the niche, how can we frame it, maybe it becomes cool to be alternative and even for kids.
Well, in that respect, you would want to change the whole world to allow a niche to have an impact. So I don't think we are suggesting to bring in the whole world, but so it's rather an invitation to you to reflect on the process of mainstreaming. And if you talk about drivers and barriers, do you then look at the internal organization of the niche? So let's the example of the night train. Do you look at the, the organization? How can we make sure that the lines are open and the prices are at a level that is acceptable, etc. And do we organize social safety on board? And those, do you look at those characteristics of the niche itself as the key arguments for why or not it's becoming mainstream? Or do you take a broader perspective and see how night training may be part of a wider process of vacation or traveling? In that case, you look at the environment in which night training may be a part of a niche or an element of that.
Yeah, that's a much better example than the one I had. But would that then it would be relevant to look at competing interests and the development of these short distance flights and so on, how that's supported by policies or whatever. Yep.
Yeah. The case night train, we were talking after the presentation yesterday, Karen and I, about if we actually, is the goal to be mainstream with such a niche. Maybe that's not possible, but we need for our sustainable consumption in total, we need a variety of niches. And that could also be like a conclusion that we don't, maybe night train in that case also mainstream and then down to a niche and not at all for a while with just cheap flights and then coming up for a niche again. And that could be steady state in that sense. And that goal not has to be mainstream again for all of our cases.
Okay, but we looked at the title of the project, which is called From Niche to Mainstream. So the question of mainstreaming. So I would agree with you that not all niches have to be mainstream. Not everyone has to fulfill all the different. But it's but at least you want to have it as an established niche. Not as an option for 5 people in Stockholm to go by wherever, you know, at night. So you want to have it as a realistic option. So it would be then not covering all travel, but at least a recognized option when you travel at a certain distance. Great.
Yes, now I have to confess this particular model is new to me, but we talked about it quite a lot, and it was in our minds anyway, listening to you all yesterday, that we do think there's a need for you to have a model, or perhaps even better, adapt and develop a model. So we're not at all saying you have to fit it into this one. We're saying use your knowledge, all the stuff that you're gathering from working together and from getting new data to develop these things. But for example, this whole question of whether you might need some niches that can't develop into mainstream, you would then have some parameters in a model that says certain things can't be, because for everyone, we talked about this bit yesterday, didn't we, informally, I think, that if everyone who travels from Stockholm to London every week was to take a night train, there isn't the capacity. So you'd have added into a model like this that there are going to be, on some things, capacity constraints. And something like trains is an obvious example of a real capacity constraint. Other things would be much more easy to imagine that nobody owns a home. We don't all, in England, everybody has to own their own home. And I understand in mainland Europe that's much less common. But we can certainly see that you could either have everybody owning their own home, or you could have nobody owning their own home. There's almost no limit on that one. And then it also occurs to me that if we take this kind of interconnection seriously, some niches, which perhaps have got constraints, and you could suggest some conditions when people can make these findings at least transferable to other areas, the existence isn't just described as a descriptive existence of night trains now, whereas at the moment we really don't have that option. It doesn't enter our heads on the whole, because there's so few of them. The very existence will have an impact on the socio-technical landscape. It will influence the culture. It might influence, scientific developments in how you improve trains or railways or, the rails. So the very existence of some niches, it's not just, we can't scale them up because we don't have because they're constrained, but actually the very thought, I could catch a night train, will change the socio-technical area and make another more sustainable option that isn't the night train, but has been imagined by me and imagined by all of us, of course. Otherwise, so the existence of niches, even if we say they might stay as niches or not get to be too big, would be playing into a larger model if you had a larger model that you were working with.
Yeah, well, I'm working in the field of public health, and there we call the process of going from niche to mainstream, we call it, how to do it is called implementation research. And so we have all these, and we call it implementing at scale, we say, for innovations in the health area. And there we have, I came to think of that one listening to you. We have various models and frameworks and theories, but we have one which is called the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research. And you've heard about it, Sophia in your course, abbreviated. And it is actually an analytical framework for looking at barriers and facilitators for implementation. And it's very useful, and I think it could even be useful here. Obviously, when it comes to the food area, but also maybe in the other areas. And I can present it at a different occasion, but it's got 5 domains which I think are really useful to structure your analysis, and that is the inner setting, so the organization, the outer setting, which is can be the whole society, and then it's the innovation itself, you look at that, and then the process, how is it going to be implemented, and also the personal characteristics of the people who are going to implement it, to take it from niche to mainstream. So I think, and then it has 5 domains and 39 constructs, I think. So it's really, I think it would be a useful framework to use to do this analysis of how, at least to look at barriers and facilitators. And as soon as we have identified them, we discuss how do we tackle these barriers and how do we use the facilitators. So that's one suggestion.
Well, I think this discussion typically illustrates that there are some theories behind the whole project, but that it's not made explicit. And I think also yesterday different elements were already mentioned, like I think, but then in different words like limits, barriers, thresholds, the drivers, opportunities, facilitators. So at least that could be one element of the theory. We have, of course, niche and mainstream as part of the theory, but then maybe also with implementation. I think we've talked about change agents or champions. That's part of the.
That's one of the constructs in Sophia.
Okay, and then the scaling or implementation, and we also talked about context. How does the environment change? And we talked about time, how this influences, and then within the project you have also the different actors, with the private companies, the public, and the policy, the municipality. So all these elements are part of your theoretical framework that can also integrate the whole different work packages.
I think this is all very useful feedback for us, and that if we bring all our different approaches to how change can happen in theory to discuss it together, and we can develop something that we can have in common, and it would help us, because as Mika said, several of us are exploring barriers, but we might not know if this is barriers in the niche or where is it, and this would enable to identify where these barriers and what are we missing actually, and that it can also actually help us to discuss where we want to be by the end of this project. What do we actually want to influence with our research? Where would we want to our research to be applied after this? So it's a very useful that I think we have to talk a lot more about.
Maybe one final sentence is that in this framework multi-level perspective, in more recent years they have developed sort of a differentiation in different pathways to move from niche to mainstream, different ways in which niches can become upskilled. So that would also be a helpful tool of if you want to operationalize this approach.
Okay. Do you want to continue, or should you tell us when we need to break?
Yeah, is it time for a break? Just a pause nu då.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can have a break now.
Yeah, maybe now. Could
Yeah. Great, that's good. Good, so like 20 minutes? Yeah, coffee and